Good evening and welcome to the Prelude lecture for this fabulous program. My name is Kristi Montesano. I am a lecturer in the musicology department at the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA. And I am also, a longtime Prelude lecturer here at La Jolla, mostly for the piano series, but I have come for SummerFest. Who are my piano people that have seen me? Yes, hello. But for many of you who haven't, so I'm a public musicologist located in Los Angeles. So yes, it's a bit of a trek, but it is a sign of how much I love the people of the La Jolla Music Society and the audiences here that I get here pretty frequently to share with you some thoughts and ideas, some historical context about the program. And I thought a lot about the, marketing and everybody, they have to put a title on program. It evokes something for us. And last night it was Baroque Fantasia. And that was very effervescent and fun. And resilience, besides feeling like, I think this is a time where resilience seems like a good thing to keep in mind. And I thought, well, how will we tie this to the program in something more than a superficial way? So I like to look at definitions. It's the nerdy scholar side of myself. So I looked up the Merriam-Webster definition for resilience. The ability of something to return to its original size and shape after being compressed or deformed. And I thought, that's a really, that's a different side of what we talk about with resilience, because there's a psychological aspect, which we'll get into, but literally the feeling that something has been constrained, suppressed, squished into a box, and the ability to come back to its original shape, form, size. Instead, if you look at the American Psychological Association, they talk about it as a process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. Both of those are at play here, but the four composers that are on tonight's program have different experiences, very different experiences of what we might call this umbrella category of resilience. I'm not even sure that it certainly applies to them differently. And I think in some ways you will see that sometimes resilience is not enough. I know, that was a downer, but I want to get a little bit real here, and I'm also going to say spoiler right now, don't be too disappointed, but I am not going to talk about Felix Mendelssohn, and I'm not going to talk about the string quartet in F minor. Why? Because to me, it's resilient adjacent, and I'll talk about how that is. There are beautiful program notes you can read. It's the most canonic work on the program, and he is the most canonic, well played, particularly in chamber concerts, of composers on the program. So I'm going to save it as Felix Mendelssohn in the context of his sister, Fanny, but also these other later examples. One thing that all of these composers have in common is that they are all ethnically Jewish. We'll talk about that as one aspect, though. That's not the immediate go-to for where the resilience come in. It's one part where resilience comes in. But I also wanted to, let's have a little lighter thing. I thought that resilience could also be this guy. So this is Stephen Nedoroscik. and better known now as Pommel Horse Guy on social media. He has, since birth, a situation with his eyes. He is visually impaired. He needs special glasses. And I was reading more about him besides just being adorably nerdy. And he's just really good at the pommel horse. And they, in fact, the men's team took the bronze, took a medal for the first time in 16 years. So resilience. But in his own way, Stephen also shows the resilience, first of all, of having a disability. And he began to train as a gymnast, then realized he was really only going forward, he was really only advancing with the pommel horse, continued with that. But he fell before, he was doing great, he fell before Tokyo. And so he didn't make the team. And he made it this time, and he just had to bring it home. He had to get a great score for them to win the bronze. So resilience was not just the idea of it's been 16 years and a bronze. Resilience is being born with something that makes it harder for you, that adds a level of difficulty because you don't automatically, and he said he sees with his hands on the pommel horse. He's not looking at all. He's just feeling. So I feel like he was a, great.
Check, check.
Check, 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 check. Let me just, how's that? Is this better? Okay. So Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, that is a mouthful. A lot of people that write about him end up saying MC. Are you able to hear now? Okay, I'm going to use the big voice. Castelnuovo, this idea of the new castle, right? So that's a typical name. But Tedesco means German in Italian. So, which is ironic given that he will eventually have to leave Europe fleeing from fascism, in Italy in particular, but obviously also together with the fascist tendencies in other places in Europe. He's here by his apartment in Florence. This is where he's born, and it's actually in 1961. So yes, he comes to the US in the late 1930s, but he is able to go back and has this amazing apartment which looks very close to possibly the Ponte Vecchio, but it's definitely on the Arno. We have to think about resilience. Okay, obviously the resilience of a Jewish creative having to leave Europe in World War II and somehow see if he can kickstart a career in a new place. That is the kind of resilience we read about with those definitions. Something we should keep in mind is that he was in his mid-40s by the time he came to the United States. So he had, in fact, created a very successful career in Italy. He was having to give something up, but he also had a lot of good friends that could help him that were either immigrants themselves or European enough and traveling that they could help out, including people like Toscanini. So he definitely was not somebody who was struggling to make his career when he left. He was lucky to have already had a professional network and a lot of attention. He'd been working with the Italian branch of the International Society for Contemporary Music. He was one of the top most performed composers on their programs in Italy. The Society of Italian Music, which was started by his teacher, also was very enthusiastic. This had composers like Respighi also working. So he had this, but when the 1930s turned over, he became increasingly concerned about the anti-Semitic propaganda that was gaining speed. It was like a slow burn because Mussolini is in power since the 20s, right, the mid-20s. So it's already, but he's starting to see it. It wasn't initially something that was, let's say, a first priority for the fascist regime. But it was gaining. And of course, we find that most hyper-nationalism and fascism is concerned about an us versus a them, and becomes concerned about a kind of national identity. And often this is, we see it again, frankly, right here, an obsession with racial purity, or some kind of like, this is a white Christian nation. Sorry, but I'm just giving, that's the propaganda right now that we hear a lot of. That obsession happens often when you have this kind of hyper-nationalism, and he was seeing it. Certainly, historically, Europe had had an anti-Semitic past, often bloody and brutal for centuries. But Castelnuovo saw this as, or MCT, saw this as a major issue, and he began to write things that reflected his concern in a lot of ways. He actually wrote a concerto called I Profeti, the Prophets, and it was premiered by Jascha Heifetz in 1933 at Carnegie Hall in New York with the New York Philharmonic and Arturo Toscanini conducting. So he was like a big thing. So I want you to keep that in mind as we roll forward. Problem, we have this, which is that in the 1938, the laws for, as it says, la difesa della razza, for the defense of the race, is approved by the consulate of ministries. Basically, the government has now said, we need these laws. And Castelnuovo then left. Basically, as war began in 1939, he and his family could leave for New York. The great thing was exactly what I said, this support that he had, which many composers or artistics would not have had. He had a lot of people on his back. He signed contracts with studios. He ended up here. There's a reason he died in Beverly Hills. He ended up in the movie business. But unlike people like Korngold, he was not getting the good contracts that made him the main composer. So he went from being the hottest kind of young modern composer in Italy to the studio composer in the studio system, where your name often isn't even put on the screen and you don't have that credit. So that was a huge, he continued to write concert music, but that's a huge lowering of professional stamina and pride and all the things you'd work toward. What do you do now? He did have, he left an amazing legacy among the composers he worked with, which included a guy named John Williams, who studied with Castelnuovo Tedesco. So one of the other people that he worked with was Andres Segovia. They met in 1932 at this International Society of Contemporary Music I mentioned. It was held in Venice that year. And this was a bromance of decades. They really, really liked each other. 36 years they collaborated. And Segovia kept pushing for more music. And Castelnuovo Tedesco wrote 35 works. So that's almost one per year for the time they knew each other. There's a whole book with the letters that they wrote to each other, which were all mostly in French, because Castelnuovo did not speak Spanish. Segovia didn't speak a good Italian, so they met in the middle with French. And what Segovia said is that he felt that Castelnuovo Tedesco had managed to create a sound that would allow the guitar to play with orchestra and get the balance right. So I found this historic performance with Segovia from 1963. And this is the third movement from the concerto for guitar with the Bell Telephone Orchestra, when they had that.
Let's go.
those were the kind of sounds that are being created. Part of the problem here in terms of resilience is that musical styles are moving on. So already in the 30s, the 1930s and into the war, we'll still have this kind of friendly, let's say, less modernist sound. This is the time of Copland's popular music. Up through the middle of the war, Rachmaninoff is still creating kind of hyper-romantic. And we'll get into another style, which is the neoclassic style. So against kind of hyper-modernistic harmonies and sounds, breaking down melody so that it's almost absent and getting to texture, you have these other more accessible sounds. But that going into the 1950s, which is when this happens, we're now post-war, and for those of you who may know, this is when we get into 12-tone composition taking over, and everybody is doing really modernistic things. And the feeling amongst composers of the time is that if you're still doing the pretty stuff in a way, like if you're doing retro, that was the kind of sound, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, that belonged to the Europe that started World War I and II. And that somehow, even politically, to look back was about both. I'll tell you one thing, Hitler and Stalin agreed on the kind of music that was okay. And what wasn't okay was modernism. So there's a political aspect, at least the audience is wanting to listen to Beethoven still, and the kind of contemporary push is toward more experimental. Electronic studios are starting to be set up at this time, and you have this. Now, the style that he's going to give here is not then what you would expect from this. This is very friendly stuff. And I actually have to show you, excuse me, I have to go to Spotify because I had a problem. Here is the guitar quintet, just listening to the opening of it. That's retro. Like that's looking way back. So again, as a popular voice, it's very winning. For the time, it was not necessarily resilient and adaptable. And a lot of composers faced this, and Korngold was another one, trying to figure out where to fit as a musician in the mid-20th century after the war. In classical music, writing music was very difficult. And we call those, the most difficult. I've taught that period to my music students, my college students. Oh, they just resist because it's very crunchy. And I have to help them understand the political reasons for this kind of outre response to harmony and melody, in a way smashing everything down. We're fine when we see Picasso do it. We're pretty good with the visuals, but when it happens orally, we have a harder time. So that was also part of the world that Castelnuovo Tedesco was trying to break into, this mid-century world where things were shifting. In the end, he's just not that well remembered, sadly. And that gets into another thing of resilience, which is, oddly, a sense of posthumous resilience. And this is about gatekeeping, which is a big part of the idea. Are we going to bring in some of the power for resilience for some of these names that are showing up on programs where people are going to go, who's that? So this actually gets into our ability to be flexible and adapt and recognize maybe you don't always have to look for the familiar name every time on a program, to invest in it, to take the chance on it. And Castelnuovo, I think, is somebody that definitely deserves that. This one, I actually love this guy, Erwin Schulhoff. He's kind of making a comeback. I mean, partly he's making a comeback because it's so his music is so winning and so sardonic, so clever. He was really sharp in his, but he had a really funny sense of humor. I'm trying to remember the exact name of one of these pieces, but it's something like Sonata Erotica or if anybody remembers this. Anyway, it just has a woman with a script performing a nice evening with her lover, like vocally. That's a whole piece. So when I heard this, I thought, okay, this guy, he has something that is sharp and sardonic while he's still writing these amazing classical compositions. I put this up, this is with his son Peter, and I just thought that was such a sweet, sweet picture. Born in Prague, so Czech, but I think of German and Jewish, also Jewish ethnicity. And he would die instead, that should be, sorry about Würzburg. He will die in a concentration camp. He actually dies of illness. He is sick. He becomes sick with tuberculosis, and he dies there. So what does resilience mean when you're murdered during your career? And again, I think it comes to some sense of resilience for him is not the post, I emigrated, I don't have a career anymore. It's what he did during his lifetime. And he was not just a problem for the Germans because of his ethnicity, but also because of his politics. He was definitely avant-garde. He used to pass out a pamphlet that had this on it in 1919, right after the war. Absolute art is revolution. It requires additional facets for development, leads to overthrow in order to open new paths, and is the most powerful in music. The idea of revolution in art has evolved for decades under whatever sun the creators live in that for them, art is the commonality of man. This is particularly true in music because this art form is the liveliest and as a result reflects the revolution most strongly and deeply. The complete escape from imperialistic tonality and rhythm, the climb to an ecstatic change for the better. Those were the kind of words, along with being Jewish, that were going to get you put on what would be called the Entartete Musik exposition, the degenerate music exhibition that happened in 1938, which would have talked not just about Jewish musicians, but modernist musicians. And they loved to throw around leftist intellectual Bolsheviks. That was always a big, that would always went together. Sometimes democratic was thrown in there. So this was the kind of propaganda that was happening, but he kind of went into it and in some sense never looked back. He did go to the Soviet Union. He was, like Copland, was interested in kind of some of the communist principles, particularly as you're looking at the worldwide depression. So that leftist side was another thing that made Schulhoff dangerous. And he brought it to his art. He wasn't alone in that. The piece that you're going to hear tonight, the Divertissement for oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, written in 1927, this interwar period in German-speaking lands brought some fascinating art, often called the Neue Sachlichkeit. So it was an idea of a new objectivity. They wanted to paint what was there. It doesn't look realistic, but it's basically saying, yeah, if you get out from everything that's pretty, it's representative, but it doesn't look quite right. And one of these was Otto Dix's Metropolis, which is just an amazing painting. But the center is what people want to see, right? The party, looks like we're doing the Charleston there based on the end legs. We've got a swing band, have a jazz band happening there. It's notable that even here, for this person who's supposed to somehow be talking about it, you still see a racial caricature of the black drummer in the back. But it's the sides that are telling you about the life outside, the prostitutes, but also this man who is basically crippled from the war, has lost his legs. He is an amputee. The one looks like he's sleeping or dead or drunk. The dog is attacking him. On the other side, the same thing, a beggar. It is a man with the mask. Apparently, he's lost part of his face. And that was Otto saying, yeah, while all of you are partying in there, this is what's going on. So this sensibility during the interwar period was very strong, and Schulhoff as a musician was definitely part of that, was just in a way, those sardonic things that he would throw in, and his engagement with jazz was actually a political kind of progressiveness that was being expressed through art. For many composers, including Igor Stravinsky, neoclassicism will be the style they embrace. What this meant was go back to the forms, the kind of clean architectural forms of the 18th century to write your music. Get away from the big Mahlerian symphonies and the big Straussian operas. And it was very clean, and what they felt was objective, in a sense. So it was an anti-romantic, again, for a kind of political sense that those excesses are what led to nationalism, led to the kind of things that were happening in World War I. So from 1919 through the 20s, you get this strong neoclassic style embrace. And I wanted to show you, these are, I think, strongly related. I would be surprised if Schulhoff didn't know about the octet. At this time, Stravinsky is in Paris, so he would have known about this, and he wrote about it in very strong terms. So listening to them, I think you can hear some of the relationship. Here's the third movement, the finale of Stravinsky's octet for winds and brass. Now, keeping in mind, here's the opening of the Schulhoff Divertissement. So you can, I think, hear the DNA relate, right? The general approach to composition. But the Schulhoff, you know, when you look at the Stravinsky movements, it's all very, you know, Symphonia, theme of variation, finale, very clean. Instead, Schulhoff, you know, he starts with the overture, so the French overture, and then we get burlesque, the romancero. I think that this was actually a late writing of Heinrich Heine, so I think he was actually referring to Heine for this. The Charleston, another theme and variations with fugue, so there's our 18th century neoclassic, but Florida, no idea. I think it is supposed to, again, be a jazzy Southern American thing that comes out, and then the little rondo and finale. So we get a lot of character, and you're going to be listening for those jazz inflections. To use jazz, to bring that in, even though often these composers themselves were racist, they didn't think of it, was a political act. It was a way of bringing popular music. It was a way of bringing American music. It was a way of bringing black music. And all of those things in Germany was a huge, that was a signifier. Those works were condemned at the Entartete Musik, where they kept saying these foreign rhythms, which is, you know, just to have, which I don't know, you haven't listened to your Beethoven enough, because he knew how to throw those in when he needed to, right? So this was just the idea, it's othered. It is not a music we want to hear. So Schulhoff's resilience comes very much during his lifetime and is still challenging us in a way to not always go with the beaten path, to experiment, to be open to new types of music, to be cheeky once in a while, even irreverent sometimes to music. Don't treat this like a church, right? Let it be an experience that embraces all human ideas and emotions. And finally, with the time we have, Miss Fanny, I always find it frustrating. When I was a music student in the 1980s, the textbooks did not have any women in them. The only thing they mentioned is that Clara Schumann was married, she was a great pianist married to Robert, and Fanny was the sister of Felix. That's literally, and that she did some music too. So I've watched this change, but I noticed that when they finally brought Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel in, and they chose the trio to put into the anthology that's traditionally taught, they chose the Andante. And I always thought about that. The Andante, it's light, sweet, a middle movement. But everybody knows that when you're laying down as a composer, it's the first movement or the final movement where the fire usually comes. And I thought, wow, they've girlized her even when they're bringing her in. You know, give them the pretty Andante or the sparky. And, you know, I related to this in the sense that I once gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times. They asked me to talk about my research, which was about Bach's music and serial killers. And modernism and general. And I was still called by the journalist, who was younger than I was, said, the perkiest musicologist this side of the Mississippi. Fanny, I see you. There is a sense where, as though the things that, you know, that being a woman somehow automatically the perky was more than the fact that I was intensely looking at Bach post-war reception in the United States and its things with like AI and robots and serial killers, which isn't quite as feminized as the other. So I have a strong sense of what we do. The program note, I hope you'll read it, because it talks specifically about the way that Mendelssohn, being this true prodigy, the Felix being this prodigy, and just, I mean, he really out-Mozart's Mozart in a lot of ways. But it talks about the parallel between those two, that you have an older sister also trained in music, the younger brother becomes the star. And I looked for this, and both Felix and Fanny will die quite young. So I'm looking at this. This is a romanticized 1895 like etching of the two of them. And you'll see, what do you take from this image? Who is active and who is not? He's playing the piano and she's leaning her head against him. Let's compare it to this. Who's in charge? Wolfie's in charge. Why? Because he's mansplaining with his hands. He's crossed over and the attention's there. So what we have to remember is that for us to know Fanny at all is an incredible achievement. She studied with Carl Zelter just as her brother did. But access to the professional life of a composer was not in the cards for a fairly, let's say, lower upper class, well brought up, respectable family in Berlin, married woman. So once Felix went off to college and ended his music studies, effectively hers ended as well. In I should have put 1847, let this be, I'll correct this later, but she didn't live that long, unless she spoke to me. The year of her death, she wrote to somebody, "Thus I have made up my mind to publish my things." And then she died. Again, resilience. She kept writing, she kept composing. Most of them are like oratorio movements and choral things and chamber things because you don't have an orchestra at hand the way your brother does. You don't get to concertize around Europe the way your brother does. Publishers are not going to go to you, and we believe now that some of His works were actually written by her and signed with his name in order to get them published. So the idea of access is another form of resilience. And this beautiful, I want to recommend this piece. This is called Das Jahr. It's one of the months, it's the year. And she wrote a beautiful piano cycle for each month of the year. And it was her husband, Hensel, an artist, who put these beautiful illustrations. This autograph was not found until the late 1980s. Not 1880s, I got it right this time, 1980s. So she has, in a way, again, resilient in her life. And now it's up to programs like tonight to make it be possible to respect that resilience and give it its greater flourishing. I hope you understand that's why I didn't talk about Felix tonight. For his story is known far better, and again, you have these beautiful program notes. I would like you to listen to the F minor string quartet, one of the great ones, which he wrote as he was mourning the death of his sister, and he himself passed 6 months later. The whole family suffered from stroke syndrome, so this was genetically there. Listen to that, but not as the piece of the program, but just a piece of the program. Thank you.